Hi, my name is Richard Brennan. I am a faculty associate with Arizona State University. I teach their jazz trombone lessons and teach some of the jazz ensembles there. And I am working with the Nash Education interns to play through some of the Arizona All-State Jazz Etudes and telling you some approaches on how to work through them and, get through them successfully. So I'm going to be playing the first phrase of Etude number 1. So, it's a 4-bar phrase, and ideally, that's what you'll be aiming for in most swing jazz music. It's usually in 4-bar phrases or 8-bar phrases. And you'll also want to take notice of where all of the accents lie on the page. One, they're all on upbeats. That lies in the traditional swing pattern that you might encounter. So, da do da da dee da do da do da do da. So it'll be really important stylistically for you to catch those accents if you want it to sound authentic. Now, continuing on after the first phrase, we're going to be looking at measures 5, 6, and 7, as that's the next phrase in the chart. So a challenge that you might encounter when playing through the etude in one run is that the jump from B natural in the previous measure to D natural in the start of this phrase is a major sixth, and it can be deceptively hard to accurately let each note there speak. So what you'll need to do is when you start the second phrase, you'll want more air support to make sure that the concert D speaks out more. Continuing on with the next phrase, we start in measure 8, which is essentially just a pickup to measure 9. Now you'll notice that it continues on rather naturally to the next phrase, but I stopped there because an important thing to think about here is matching the style between do do da 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 dee do do da 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 dee do. Since those phrases are essentially one motif being repeated, you have to make sure that you're playing them rather similarly. That way it seems like a bigger phrase idea instead of two separate ideas. And moving on, the goal would be to aim to play the last 6 measures in one breath, which is pretty taxing for a brass player. So you'll want to get da da do da do da do da da dee do da do da da do da 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 dee da da do da do da do da. Now we are going to be looking at Etude number 2, which is a straight 8th ballad. As a brass player, and especially as a trombonist, the challenge that you're going to encounter the most with playing ballads is that you have to articulate everything, and your goal is to try and get as smooth of a legato articulation as you can. So just in that first phrase, which is only 4 measures long, you can hear that you'll want to try and get a do 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 dee do, do 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 dee do. And along with that, you're going to want to try and catch a breath on the beat of each measure, beat 1 to be specific. So do 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 dee do, do 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 dee do, to try and catch the natural phrasing that's going on there. Now we're going to be looking at the second 4-bar phrase in Etude number 2. So, I might have fracked a couple of notes, and maybe that'll happen to you too. But the goal here is to make sure that you're using enough breath support so that that doesn't happen. Additionally, with the breath support, you're going to want to try and get all the way from the second measure of the phrase to the end of the phrase in one breath. So, do da do 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 da do do dee da do do dee da do do dee da da da. And right there is where you breathe before the next part. And one other thing to note here is that in measure 7, the second bar of this phrase, that concert F, you might be inclined to play it in first because that's where you're comfortable, but consider using an option of position 4 on your slide so that you can naturally get F, F sharp, and G in one partial instead of having to do a partial break. And now we're going to be looking at the third phrase of Etude number 2. So again, you can tell that I might need to use more breath support the way that I'm playing it, and that's because it's expanding a larger range of the register of your instrument. So especially as you get up to that concert A, da dee da dee da, not only will you need more air, but you'll also need faster air. And additionally, throughout this whole etude, one thing that I haven't mentioned yet is that you might want to choose to use some vibrato, whether that be jaw vibrato or slide vibrato, whatever is easier for you in the section that you're playing. It's usually up to your own discretion. And now we're going to be looking at the last phrase of Etude number 2. So in the first 2 measures of this phrase, you're going to want it to be one continuous breath. And ideally, you'll be breathing right on on beat 2 of the second to last measure. So da 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 do 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 da. And the last thing that I'd like to comment on here is that it might seem easier to play the last note, the concert D, in 4th position. That way you have less slide movement from concert B to D. But if you have intonation issues there, it might just be a better choice to go up to 1st position due to the fact that you're not changing partials and because you probably have better intonation tendencies there. All right, and now we're going to be looking at Etude number 3. And before we start, you'll see that it says relaxed samba, half note equals 96. The half note is important because in a samba, you're going to want to settle into 1 and 3 as the parts of the measure that you're going to be grooving on, right? So da 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 da. So as long as you're tapping your foot or moving your body somewhere so that you can feel these bigger pulses, you'll be setting yourself up for success. And to start, we're going to be looking at the first half of Etude number 3. It goes by rather quickly. That's why you'll basically be thinking of it in 2 halves opposed to 4 separate parts of an etude. But the thing that I'd like to really draw attention to are where the accents lie in the first phrase. So da 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 da. That's more of a bigger subdivision that's going on that you might want to try and add emphasis to. They're marked with accents, so you might be thinking about it like hitting those individually, but remove all the notes in between and you get woo, and you get ah. Additionally, something else that you might want to work on is in measure 5, do 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 da 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 da. That's going to need to be a very smooth articulation, and you want to avoid clipping any of those notes. So it's just one breath of a phrase. Do 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 da 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 da. And to think about that, imagine that as a brass player, your articulations are running your fingers through a faucet instead of turning the sink off and on, right? Do 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 da 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 instead of do 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 da or t t t t t. I hope that makes sense. And now we're going to be looking at the second half of Etude number 3. So to start, you'll notice that I played the last note in 6th position instead of 1st, and that's because you'll get a much more fluid slide movement if you do instead of. That second option is just a little bit too much work, and for something like a samba, the whole feeling is supposed to be relaxed. Emphasis on relaxed samba at the top of the page. And even though I broke this up into 2 halves, you'll want to take notice of the fact that in the last measure of the first half, that is actually the start of the phrase of the second half. You're not starting the phrase on the first upbeat, you're actually starting out on beat 4 of the previous measure. Now we are going to be looking at Etude number 4, which is straight 16th funk. To start, we're going to break this down into smaller chunks than the previous etudes, and we're just going to do 2 measures here. So even though it sounds nice and relaxed and easy, like the ballad, you're going to have to aim for a nice smooth articulation if you really want to let the groove settle in. And moving on, we're going to play the next 2 measures. I'm going to be taking the first little phrase down an octave, but when you're working on it, to hit that B flat that's up there, you're going to want to use fast air and a lot of air control. So in that first phrase, da 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 da, and then in the last phrase, dee doo dit dit dit, you're going to want to draw some attention to those accents because that's kind of what gives the funk feel a little bit more of its style. And moving on, we're going to play the next phrase. Same thing as we've been talking about. Legato articulation, making sure that the accents speak through, and also just familiarizing yourself with how this melody kind of settles in its phrasing. Moving on, the next phrase is going to be a little bit tricky as you're going back up to that B flat, and you're going to want to continue all the air support down in one measure. So in order to hit that B flat nice and clean, you're going to want to be able to audiate it before you play it. If you can think about the key being in C, since this is the form of a C blues, you'll think of that as the lowered 7th. Da, dee, but up an octave. One thing that might help you play that measure as well is if you try and do a little bit of a crescendo through it, just to kind of get the air support going as you get into the lower register there. And now we're going to move on. So, again, in that first part, do-do-do-do-dee-da, as smooth articulation as you can aim for. And then the next measure here, if there's any part of that that's not going to speak through your horn very well, it's going to be the G, and then in the next measure, the F. So the lowest part of that measure. So make sure that whatever you do when you're practicing this, you're making sure that those notes speak. And now we're going to play the last phrase of this etude. Probably the easiest part of the whole etude is saved for the end, which is nice. But there is one thing in there that might trip you up, and that is the dotted eighth rest before the last note. And just in this whole etude, since it's at a nice quarter note equals 90, you have to make sure that you're giving all of your rests the appropriate amount of space that they deserve. Quarter note rests will feel longer than you think, and this dotted eighth is going to also be longer than you think.